We're just going to take a moment to bring you a word from our sponsor, The Ridge. This is a photograph of my dad's actual wallet. Who needs a wallet that is that big, bulky, and ugly? It can't be comfortable to carry around, and when it's in the back pocket of his pants, I have no idea how he sits on it. That's why for Father's Day, I'm getting my dad a Ridge wallet, and I think he'll love it. Ridge wallets are sleek and stylish, but they're still incredibly practical. They hold up to 12 cards, plus all your cash. They also fit comfortably into any pocket. Ridge wallets are equipped with RFID blocking, so not only do they look better, but they are also safer. Right now, The Ridge is having an awesome Father's Day sale, and you should check it out. Just go to ridge.com/listed, and you can save 10%, plus get free worldwide shipping and returns. Help your dad ditch the bulky wallet for Father's Day. Help get him a wallet fit for the 21st century by going to ridge.com/listed. Number 3. Mary Catherine Edwards. In early 1995, 31-year-old Mary Catherine Edwards lived in a townhouse in Beaumont, Texas. She lived alone, and she had just moved into the townhouse. Edwards was a second-grade teacher at a primary school, and she was beloved by her students. Edwards had an identical twin sister, and she was also a primary school teacher in Beaumont. Edwards lived a quiet life. She had a beagle, and she would take him on walks every morning and every evening. Most school days, she would stay late to plan for the next day. On Friday, January 13th, 1995, she left her school at about 5 p.m. When she got home, she took her beagle for a walk. She returned home, and she poured herself a glass of wine. She then phoned her boyfriend and talked to him for a bit. That night and the next morning, Edward's parents called her several times, but she didn't answer or call them back. So on January 15th, they went over to her home and they let themselves in. They went into the bathroom and they saw something that will probably haunt them for the rest of their lives. Their 31-year-old daughter was dead, and her partially clad body was draped over the edge of the bathtub. They immediately called the police. Mary Edwards' wrists had been handcuffed behind her back. She had been sexually assaulted. Then, while her wrists were still handcuffed behind her back, her head was held under 4 inches of water in the bathtub until she stopped moving. When her body was found, her face was still under the water and her feet were on the floor. The police looked around the townhouse and they found no signs of a break-in or forced entry. So the police thought that Edwards knew her killer. The brutal murder of the primary school teacher shocked the people of Beaumont. The police were at a loss as to who would want to kill Edwards. It wasn't long before the case went cold. The police had a sample of the killer's semen, but it was badly degraded. In 2006, a special lab in Maryland was asked to see if they could create a profile. Amazingly, they were able to create a profile, but no match to the DNA was found. So the case was shelved once again. Then, when genetic genealogy became a prominent crime-fighting tool, the investigators had a company trace the killer's family tree. In early 2021, the investigators learned that the killer was most likely one of 2 brothers. The brother with a criminal record was Clay Foreman. In 1981, 21-year-old Clay Foreman came across a high school classmate who was stranded at a gas station. He told her that he was a police officer and he offered to drive her home. He ended up tying her up with a belt, holding a knife to her throat, and raping her. Foreman was arrested and he pleaded guilty to aggravated assault. He was given 3 years of probation. The police noted other details in that crime that were similar to the murder of Mary Edwards. The investigators also found several interesting connections between Edwards and Foreman. They both attended the same high school and they were acquaintances. Edwards was close friends with Foreman's first wife. In fact, she was a bridesmaid at their wedding. At the time of Edwards' murder, Foreman was 35 years old and he was living in Beaumont. In early 2021, when genetic genealogy led investigators to Clay Foreman, he was living in Reynoldsburg, Ohio. He had worked as a bill collector, but he no longer held that position. At the time, he was working as an Uber driver. In April 2021, investigators collected some of his trash and they got a sample of his DNA. On April 29th, over 26 years after Mary Edwards' murder, 61-year-old Clay Foreman was arrested. When Foreman and Edwards' former classmates found out that Foreman had been arrested for Edwards' murder, they were shocked. At the time of his arrest, Foreman was helping plan the high school reunion. He had been tasked with creating tributes to classmates who had died since graduation. On June 3, 2021, a judge ordered that Foreman had to be returned to Texas by July 6, 2021, where he would be released. At the time of this recording, the county sheriff in Texas is working on the logistics of transporting Foreman. Number 2. Danny Croteau. In the early 1970s, the Croteau family lived in Springfield, Massachusetts. Carl and Bernice Croteau had 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls. The family was devoutly Catholic. They were incredibly close to their parish priest, Richard Levine. Levine met the family in 1967. Levine would bring the family food when money was tight. He would also babysit and take the boys out on overnight trips. The boys would also spend the night at the rectory. All 5 Croteau boys were altar servers at the church. The youngest of the Croteau boys was Danny. He was a kind young man who did things like help an elderly woman in their neighborhood by mowing her lawn and doing other errands. All he wanted in return was some cookies and milk. On April 14, 1975, 13-year-old Danny helped his mother put a rug down. Then, between 3 and 4 p.m., he went out to play. When he didn't come back home, his family started to panic. They searched for him and called around. But no one that they talked to said that they saw Danny. Carl and Bernice called the police shortly after 2 a.m. and reported him missing. Just over 6.5 hours later, a fisherman found Danny's body floating face down in the Chicopee River at the edge of the city limits. Richard Levine accompanied Carl to the police station. Levine was the one who identified the body. The next day, a detective was at the banks of the river close to where Danny's body was found, and he noticed Levine walking around. Levine asked the detective a question that he thought was odd. He asked if a stone was used in a murder and it was thrown into the river, would it still have blood on it? The detective thought that this was a strange question because the medical examiner had determined that Danny had died from multiple skull fractures. The medical examiner thought that Danny had been struck several times in the head with a rock. Also, the killer was left-handed. But none of this had been made public yet. The detective also noted that Levine was left-handed. Levine was interviewed by the detective the next day at the police station, and he claimed he had never been alone with Danny. The detective asked Danny's family about this, and they said he was frequently alone with Danny. Once again, the detective thought that Levine's behavior was odd. Why would the priest lie about something like that? On one occasion, just a week before Danny was killed, Danny came home after spending the night with Levine, and he was ill. He threw up several times. The police suspected that Danny had gotten drunk with Levine, but Levine denied giving the boy alcohol. He did say that the boy might have gotten into the liquor cabinet without his knowledge. It also turned out that when Danny was killed, he was drunk. Richard Levine presided over the funeral, and he encouraged the Croteau family to have a closed casket funeral. He said that Danny's face had been badly mangled. A detective asked the family why they had a closed casket funeral. They explained that Father Levine had told them that Danny's face was in no shape for an open casket funeral. The detective then told the family that all of Danny's injuries were on the back of his head. The detective thought that seeing Danny's face would have been too tough for the priest. The detectives then interviewed Danny's brothers. A few of them said that Levine had sexually abused them. They said he would get them drunk and then molest them. So Father Richard Levine became an early suspect in the case. But the police didn't have any physical evidence or a witness that connected him to the murder. Also, since he was a Catholic priest, they needed really strong evidence. Levine was being protected by the diocese, who refused to cooperate with the police investigation. This made Danny's family angry. Danny's father, Carl, asked the district attorney, at the very least, why weren't they going after Levine for the sexual abuse? The district attorney, who happened to be good friends with the bishop, said that it would endanger the murder investigation. So while the police had a promising suspect, the case went cold. For nearly the next 2 decades, Levine continued to do parish work. Then, in 1991, 19 years after Danny's murder, Richard Levine was charged with sexually assaulting 5 boys. This led to more men and boys coming forward and accusing Levine of sexually abusing them. Around the same time, Danny's murder case was reopened. A piece of rope had been found at the crime scene and there was some blood on it. It was determined to be type B blood. Only about 9% of the population have type B blood. Danny had type O blood, but Richard Levine had type B blood. The investigators were hoping to build a profile from the DNA, but the tests were inconclusive. So Richard Levine remained a prime suspect in the murder, but he still wasn't charged. In 1992, Richard Levine, who was facing 12 charges stemming from the sexual abuse allegations, pleaded guilty to sexually abusing 2 boys. He was given 10 years of probation, and he had to attend 7 months of sex offender counseling. He also had to stop being a parish priest. In 1993, the Catholic Church paid out more than $1.4 million to settle claims for 17 people who brought lawsuits against Levine. 10 years later, in 2003, Richard Levine was defrocked. After Levine was defrocked, he lived with his parents in Chicopee, Massachusetts. He lived just 7 miles from the Croteau's residence. Danny Croteau's case was reopened again in 2021. Over 5 days in April and May 2021, the district attorney and a state trooper interviewed Richard Levine. He never admitted to killing Danny, but he did make some incriminating statements. Levine said that he brought Danny to the banks of the river. Levine said he didn't remember hitting him, but he did remember shoving him. He remembers seeing him face down in the water. He left and came back, and he was still floating face down. Levine said, "I just remember feeling heartbroken, seeing his body in the river, because I was responsible." One of the interviewers said, "Why did you leave him down by the river? You left him there." Levine responded, "Yeah, that is my great regret. He was a nice little kid. I'd sooner forget the whole thing, frankly." After the series of interviews, the district attorney's office finally decided that after 49 years, they had enough evidence to arrest Levine. On May 21st, they started to write up an arrest warrant. But then they learned, just hours earlier, Richard Levine had died of respiratory failure related to COVID-19 complications. The former priest was 80 years old. Everyone involved in the case in the Croteau family was disappointed that Levine didn't face justice on Earth. But the Croteau family said that there is now a greater power he'll have to answer to. The police said that they do not think that Danny was Levine's only victim. They did not release the names of any other potential victims, and they are continuing to investigate. They now consider the case of Danny Croteau to be closed. Number 1. Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitzke. In early 1956, 18-year-old Lloyd Bogle was an airman, and he was stationed at the Maelstrom Air Force Base in Montana. He grew up in Waco, Texas. Adjacent to the Air Force Base is the city of Great Falls, Montana. While stationed at the Air Force Base, Lloyd started dating 16-year-old Patricia Kalitzke, who lived in Great Falls. The two were apparently quite enamored with each other, and they had even talked about getting married. But tragically, those plans would never become more than just talk. On January 3, 1956, 3 boys were hiking in a park just outside of Great Falls. They came upon an area that was a known lover's lane. They found the dead body of 18-year-old Lloyd Bogle lying beside his car. His wrists were bound behind his back with his belt, and he had been shot once in the head. The boys went and got help. The police searched the car and the area around it, and they found valuables and money. What they didn't find was 16-year-old Patricia Kalitzke. But it wouldn't take long before someone found her. The next morning, 8 miles away from Lloyd's car, a road worker noticed something unusual at the bottom of a 20-foot embankment. It was the dead body of 16-year-old Patricia Kalitzke. She was fully clothed. She had been shot once in the back of the head. The police initially ruled out robbery as the motive because nothing had been stolen. They also didn't think it was a sex crime. Instead, they thought that the murder most likely stemmed from something like a love triangle. There were no signs of a struggle, so the police thought that the couple knew their killer. The police had several suspects, but they were all cleared. A massive reward was offered, but it did not lead to any arrests. Eventually, the case went cold. 45 years later, in 2001, the case was reopened. It turned out that the medical examiner had taken a vaginal swab for Patricia. Amazingly, it had been well preserved. Forensic experts found semen, and they were able to create a DNA profile. It turned out that the semen did not belong to Lloyd Bogle. So the police changed their theory and decided that the double murder was a sex crime. The police compared the DNA to 35 different suspects, but they didn't find a match. So the case went cold again. Then, after Joseph James D'Angelo was identified as the Golden State Killer in April 2018 thanks to genetic genealogy, the investigators of Great Falls were hoping that the person who killed the couple could be identified using the same technique. In 2019, they had Bogle Technology, a DNA technology company in Virginia, examine some more of the evidence to see if they could find any more DNA. Then the DNA was entered into voluntary genealogical databases. Investigators then traced the killer's family tree and came up with a suspect, Kenneth Gould. Gould was born and raised in Great Falls. At the time of the murders, he would have been 28 years old. Gould did not have a criminal record, and he wasn't interviewed or considered a suspect. What is known about Gould is that in 1952, when he was 24, he married 16-year-old Lulu Bell Brown. About a month before the murders, Lulu Bell gave birth to a daughter. Tragically, in 1960, the daughter, who was 4, fell ill and died shortly afterward. Sometime after the murders and the death of his daughter, Gould and his family moved to Geraldine, Montana, and then to Hamilton, which is also in Montana. Then finally, the Gould family settled in Oregon County, Missouri, in 1967. When Gould was connected to the murder of the couple, it was too late to charge him. Gould had died in 2007 at the age of 79. The police would have exhumed his body to get a DNA sample, but he had been cremated. So the investigators got DNA samples from Gould's surviving children. Their DNA proved it was Gould's DNA found on the vaginal swab. After 65 years, the police in Great Falls, Montana, felt confident in saying that the murders of Lloyd Bogle and Patricia Kalitzke were officially solved. Their murders are two of the oldest cold cases to be solved thanks to genetic genealogy. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Please don't forget to check out the latest episode of our podcast, Into the Killing. In our latest episode, we discussed the List family murders. It was one of the most famous cases that was ever solved because of America's Most Wanted. You can find Into the Killing on Amazon Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and anywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.